pleased to have Joe Bell today, and he's going to talk about the Moors for Lynchingng. He's been involved with it for many, many years.
Many years.
Thank you for being here.
And thank you for the kind invitation. I'm convinced that the modern civil rights movement began shortly after World War II. This takes place in Georgia. It takes place in a town called Monroe. Returning African American soldiers were unable, or it was very difficult for them to vote. At that particular time, in Georgia, the Democratic Party was an all-white only primary. That year in 1946, the law was deemed to be unconstitutional, so it gave African Americans their first opportunity to participate in the democratic process. By way of background, there was a gentleman, and this is all, it's an ever-evolving story. There was a gentleman by the name of Maceo Snipes. Look him up on Wikipedia, M-A-C-E-O-S-N-I-P-E-S. Maceo Snipes comes back after wearing the uniform of this country and wants to be the first African American to vote in Fulton County. Maceo goes to vote. He comes home. The next night he's visited by two members of the Ku Klux Klan. They claimed that he came after them with a knife, or it was over a debt that he had owed them. He was shot in the back, had to walk 3 miles to the hospital, was put into a room the size of a closet. The doctor, 6 hours later, removes the bullets from Maceo's back. He said, "You need a transfusion." Well, we don't have any black blood. Okay, 2 nights later, my clients, how I initially got involved in this matter, were sharecroppers. George W. Dorsey, who also wore the uniform of this country and who fought 5 years, both in the North African and the Pacific Front, is married to May Dorsey, and they share the sharecropping cottage with Roger and Dorothy Malcolm. Dorothy Malcolm confides to her husband Roger that the landowner, Barnett Hester, is messing with her sexually. Roger becomes enraged, stabs Barnett Hester with a knife or an ice pick. Hester's taken to the local hospital. Roger's taken to local jail, where a high bail was placed upon him. There's a farmer who was getting ready, who was a known Klan member by the name of Lloyd Harrison. Lloyd Harrison wants to have additional hands pick the cotton crop. So he was able to go and post bail for Roger. However, he takes a very circuitous route home from the local jail. As a matter of fact, Roger passes the Dorsey residence. He gets to an area called the Moores Ford Bridge, which separates Walton County from Onakee County. As they approach the bridge, there's 2 cars in front of the couples. The couples are Roger and Dorothy, George and May. Lloyd Harrison's operating the vehicle. So as they just about cross the bridge or enter into the bridge, the car is stopped, and there's a gang of 30 to 100 people waiting for their arrival. This all had to do, again, with the election, and it's very analogous to the Trump-Clinton election in a way. Georgia had what they call the county-wide unit vote system, meaning there's about approximately 159 counties in Georgia. And of course, the area, which is Fulton County, which is Atlanta, has the biggest population, of course. But the county-wide unit system was, if you could win one of the smaller counties, they would have the same number of representatives as Fulton County. So although Talmadge was the governor at the time, Talmadge lost the popular vote, but won the county-wide vote in the more remote areas of Georgia. So he ran against a fellow by the name of Carmichael. Carmichael was more progressive. Eugene Talmadge was an avowed segregationist, never wanted to have blacks vote. As a matter of fact, getting back to Snipes, when Snipes was taken to the hospital, he lived near a small black church. And it was posted on the black church, a sign outside of it, the first and last nigger to vote in this county. So getting back to this tragedy, they crossed the Moores Ford Bridge and there's a gang waiting for them. Roger is given the worst of the treatment in that they came to the car, and it's been well documented because I represent Anthony Pitch and Laura Wexler, who are the only two who have written upon this tragedy. Roger is shot in the face with a shotgun. One of the women in the car recognized somebody in the gang. Women were usually not subject to being lynched, and lynch doesn't always mean being hung. It could mean a mob violence. It could be by drowning. It could be by dragging the bodies throughout the county. So what happened is that she recognized one of the men. So the women were taken out of the vehicle too. They were taken down a riverbank and they were shot over 60 times. Their skulls were shattered. The scene was horrific. As I indicated, George Dorsey, who just went along with the ride, along with his wife, to help his cousin get bailed out of jail. And it was really a disgrace at how he had fought for this country and how he was treated on his way back. So what happens is that for 39 hours, due to the lack of police, they didn't have adequate staffing. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation becomes involved. The FBI becomes involved in investigating this matter. As a matter of fact, Harry Truman, who basically came from segregationist Missouri, received over 30,000 telegrams from people that were outraged. There were demonstrations in other parts of the country as well. And Harry Truman knew he was running for re-election, and he couldn't annoy or upset the Southern Democratic South, because you had George Russell, you had Richard Russell in Georgia, you had all of the southern states that were basically the bastion for the Democratic vote. But Harry Truman, after also receiving a letter from the NAAC chairman at that time, Attorney Thurgood Marshall, as well as Martin Luther King Jr. as a sophomore at Morehouse College, wrote to him and said, there's a lack of equality between the white and the Negroes in the South. Truman visited for the first time in his life the NAACP and was absolutely horrified that a veteran of this country, somebody wearing the uniform of this country, would be treated in such a fashion as these four couples were. So Truman contacts Hoover, and I just did my own little research on this not that long ago, because we have an argument on October 22nd. There were 4,186 people living in Monroe, which is Walton County, Georgia. The FBI, in a 4-month investigation, interviewed with 25 staff members, 2,790 people who lived in that community. After a 4-month investigation, the case is presented to a grand jury. The grand jury is hosted by a gentleman by the name of Hoyt Davis. And the jury meets for 16 days. Again, 2,790 people interviewed. 106 to 125. I think you'll find the slideshow to be, with Chip, the creator, of most interesting. 2,790 interviewed, 106 to 125 participate. A 16-day grand jury. Nobody's brought to justice. Okay? The crime scene was left unattended for 39 hours. People removed body parts as souvenirs, pieces of their robe, pieces of their teeth. They say Roger Malcolm was shot in the face with a shotgun, was barely recognizable, both by the coroner's inquest and by Dan Young. Forgot to tell you this too. They take the 4 bodies to a funeral home. The funeral director says, I'm not going to embalm these Negro bodies. They have to go to a Negro funeral home. So thank God there was one in town, owned and operated by a very courageous man by the name of Dan Young, who was sort of the intermediary between the white community and the Negro community. Dan Young, at his own cost and expense, embalmed the bodies, but he said Malcolm's was so bad that he had to use plaster of Paris. The women had shots in the face that they could barely put the plaster that they had to use so they could be presentable to those people paying their respects to those individuals who were that night. So, how did I get involved in this? Many years ago, I was admitted to the United States Supreme Court along with a bunch of other people. It was nothing special, it was just part of a group. But part of the interesting plight of this was that at the end of the induction ceremony as to become a member of the Supreme Court, I was able to be introduced to a gentleman by the name of Anthony Pitch. And Anthony Pitch is a fellow who always took the plight of the underdog. Anthony Pitch has written many, many books. Their Crime Was Being Jewish. He wrote his most authentic book on the day that Lincoln was shot. You know, the Bill O'Reilly book is very entertaining, but it's factually inaccurate. Anthony Pitch's book is the only book sold in the Smithsonian Institute because of its historical veracity. So I had an opportunity to meet Anthony, and he said to me, he would also give tours on the day Lincoln was shot. You would meet him in front of the White House, and he would show you where Lincoln was, the fact that there was no Secret Service there at the time, and he would take you where the Secretary of State Seward lived, which was across from the White House, where Vice President Johnson was staying in a hotel, where Mary Surratt and the conspirators lived. So I took the tour, and I also had a part-time job at the County College of Morris, and would often take my students there as well because of just the incredible wealth of information that this man possessed. So on one of the tours, he said to me, hey Joe, I'm writing a book on the Moores Ford lynching. I'm writing a book on the Moores Ford lynching and wondering if you could help me. And I said, how can I help you? And he said, I need the transcripts of the grand jury that was convened by Hoyt Davis in 1946. Okay? Yeah. Good. I said, first of all, I'm a New Jersey attorney. I don't practice in Georgia. So what I'll do is, I'll make an application. I made an application to become a member of the Georgia Bar. I became a member of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So when we first began our quest, I called the clerks, I called the U.S. Attorney, and I said, we need the transcripts of these proceedings. Well, Mr. Bell, you understand that those records are long gone, those records are lost. Those were destroyed in a flood in 1972 in Athens. I got the okey-doke runaround, which is okay. So I went to the court. The judge did telephonically said, well, Mr. Bell, the U.S. Attorney has indicated to us that the files are lost, misplaced, missing. So I'm going to deny your petition without prejudice. So I said, fine, Your Honor. 2 years later, almost to the date, my friend Anthony Pitch finds the files in the National Archives and Records Administration outside of Baltimore, Maryland. I immediately called the court, I called the U.S. Attorney. We found the files in a mismarked box in the National Archives and Records Administration, probably as a result of the FBI concluding their investigation, sending it back to J. Edgar Hoover, then Hoover sending it over to the National Archives. So, okay, he says, Mr. Bell, you can come back down to Georgia and make your application. We had to make our application in Macon, Georgia. And it was before Judge Treadwell. And Judge Treadwell tried to evaluate the case. What he looked at were several things. Number one, this year marks the 73rd anniversary of the grand jury inquest. The fact that there were no witnesses left to be interviewed. There was no more persons to bring to trial. The fact that, so much time had passed that there was what they call a historical exception to the rule of grand jury secrecy. Grand jury secrecy came to this country through the Anglo-American tradition, in that you don't release grand jury transcripts because of the fact that you don't want the name of witnesses involved, or you don't want the name of perpetrators. But Judge Treadwell was able to release the records. The government, not content with that, filed an appeal. So we go back to Atlanta, where the Circuit Court of Appeals is, and in February of 2018, in the 2-1 decision, I was lucky and I won again. I won again, and I likened the case in time to a few things. If you look back 73 years, which is a long time, but there are other cases where they have released grand jury transcripts. Haldeman v. Sirica, where they had the Nixon grand jury, Jimmy Hoffa, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, the grand jury investigation into that as well. And we made the argument that these records can be released. In a 2-1 decision, we won. The interest in this case is unbelievable. I've never been to Monroe, Georgia in my life. I was invited down this year to get the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Man of the Year for the Moores Ford incident. And every year there's an annual reenactment. An annual reenactment. There's the interest in the case will just not go away. I met the granddaughter of Roger Malcolm. I met relatives of the Dorseys. But getting back to Harry Truman, I give Harry Truman a new look in life. Harry Truman did more for the advancement of civil rights in this country than any other president. Had a very difficult time. He knew he couldn't get a civil rights bill through the Southern Senate. What he did instead was an executive order, 9808, which created the first civil rights commission in the United States of America. He then subsequently passed another executive order integrating the military, and the third integrating the bureaucracy. So Harry Truman was quite courageous for a time in America when things were not on a level playing field. So back to Atlanta we go. If you could, back to Atlanta we go on October 22nd. The case has taken on a tremendous interest in the South. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution's involved. There's a variety of, I was all by myself. And when you go against the government, they have all of the resources in the world. And here I am, a little guy from Rockaway, trying this case in Atlanta. And they come in with an army of attorneys and the best and brightest. But you know what? I think history is on our side in this case. And I think that the balancing tests are in our favor. I believe that because of the fact of the passage of time, the interest in the case, the fact that there's no one to be brought to justice, that it's been deemed a cold case, that we're hoping, here's another bump in the road. during the course of this case, Anthony Pitch passes away. So it creates another burden to get his family, and they're well-educated young men and women, to step in to write the epilogue of the book. So we also have Laura Wexler, who also wrote a companion book in connection with this as well, serving as an intervener. Sure, please, thank you, Mayor. But again, I have to now go before almost like a firing squad, and I don't know how friendly a firing squad it is. It's the judges from Alabama, Georgia, and Florida that make up the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and we're on for October 22nd, almost 2 weeks from today. That's the story.
Is that the final?
No, I think this case is
Don't we go to Supreme Court?
I think it may, because the circuits are currently divided. There are some circuits, like the Second Circuit in New York, that released the Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, the Biaggi, the Seventh Circuit that did the Carlson case. So I don't think it's going to end there. Win, lose, or draw, I think we may be going all the way. As a matter of fact, the District Court of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, just yesterday, one of the judges has opined, and it's all tied in to the craziness of the Mueller investigation. They wanted the grand jury transcripts of the Mueller investigation, so this becomes rather timely.
What's the outcome that you're seeking?
The release of the records as to why no one was brought to justice. In a town of 4,186, 2,790 people interviewed, a 4-month, listen, if anybody's ever done any kind of criminal defense work or anything at all, I've represented people. Usually by the time you go into the U.S. Attorney's Office, you're hit like by a wave. They have facts, they have affidavits, they have confessions. You're dead. You're dead to rights, and the best thing you can do is get the best plea offer for your client. Tell me why. You know what Hoover said? An iron curtain of silence descended upon this community, that no one would speak about the horrific act that occurred. And you know what? For somebody who wore, I guess I get a little sentimental with this, because I didn't serve, but somebody who put 5 years of their life in the North African and Pacific Front, and snipes who come back as returning veterans, they need their day of justice.
And so the justice would be getting out this information
To find out why.
Learning from it why.
There's reasons
and
why.
Is there anything else that could come out of it?
You know, there could be. You know, some people speculate that maybe the law enforcement officials were involved in it. Some people speculate that the grand jurors were related to the witnesses, and hence there would be no fairness or nobody brought to justice. So I promise you that I'll carry the football across the goal line for Anthony. If anybody has any questions, I mean, I know there's a lot to, is there anything else? Mayor, would you still come? Sure. Here's Anthony Pitch. His book, Their Crime Was Being Jewish. He was writing another book, Their Crime Was Being Black, The War of 1812. They shot Papa Dead. Guest speaker all over the place. C-SPAN, every year the annual reenactment speaker at the Ford's Theater in D.C. You can catch him. Broke my heart. We became very good friends. Sorry to see him pass. But if you keep going, I think we can cut. No, that's me. I was a little thinner now, right? And that's Anthony Pitch and I in front of the courthouse. You know how I knew I was going to win that case? We walked into the courthouse in Macon. This is the craziest story. I began my life as a Newark public school teacher. I taught in Barringer High School. I taught at 7th Avenue Junior High School. But I stayed friends with the teachers that I met early in life. And when we went into the courthouse, because I wanted to get my bearings, I didn't know, I'd never been to Macon, Georgia in my life. I wanted to know where the courtroom was. There was an African-American fellow standing at the security desk, and he says, "You're not from around here." And I said, "Well, No, I said, I'm from New Jersey. He said, well, so am I. I said, well, how did you end up down here? He said, you know, after I finished high school, he said, I joined the military, and then after the military, I took a job with the government at the courthouse. And I said, by the way, where did you go to high school? And he said, West Side High School in Newark. And one of my friends ended up as the principal there. Her name was Inez Apley. And I said to him, do you know Inez Apley? And the guy stood back, you know, and I said, by the way, your grades are still under review. This case. So I knew that was a very good omen for me. And there's the 11th Circuit, and that's where we're going to be. We have quite a few people. I've been interviewed, luckily, by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. CBS came to my office and did a story because of the interest that still exists in this particular case. That was the first victory. And these are the CNN, and I was interviewed by Mark Strausman. And there's when I was presented with the Southern Christian Leadership Award for my work with this case. And there's the late Anthony, and copies of the decisions that we have won. But I would entertain any questions if anybody has any.
So have you gotten any threats against you for?
I don't care, no. No. I do worry though a little bit about some of my friends that live in Monroe and Walton County, because I told them they have to be very, very careful. Unfortunately, somebody called me the other day, and at the Moores Ford Bridge, somebody is painting KKK signs. So I guess it's there still, but under the covers. Well, sir.
What can we as a club do to help you out? What do you need?
Nothing, just your prayers. Say a prayer that I'm good on my feet on the 22nd. That I don't do a Ralph Cramden, you know? Especially when you're in front of 12 people shooting a gun at you. Thank you so much.